A woman is born into royalty and rises to rule one of the most powerful kingdoms in ancient history. Her name is Cleopatra, Queen of Egypt. A name that did not simply survive history, but echoed through it. Yet one question still creates conflict today. What did Cleopatra really look like? The moment this question is asked, the debate begins. People argue, they get defensive. Some insist Cleopatra was European because of her Greek Macedonian dynasty. Others say she was African because she ruled Egypt, a kingdom on the African continent. But this fight is no longer only about Cleopatra's face, her ancestry, or her skin color. It is about something much bigger. It is about Africa. It is about history. It is about who gets to claim civilization. For centuries, ancient Egypt has often been separated from Africa, as if one of the world's greatest civilizations could not truly belong to the African continent. And Cleopatra stands directly in the middle of that debate. So when someone calls Cleopatra African, it challenges more than a historical image. It challenges a narrative. It forces the world to confront how Africa has been remembered, erased, and rewritten. So why does one word create so much anger? Why does Cleopatra's identity still matter after thousands of years? Today, we're diving into the controversy, the history, and the deeper reason Cleopatra's identity still shakes the world. For centuries, Cleopatra's image has been reimagined, from the seductive temptress in Roman propaganda to the tragic beauty in Hollywood films. Cleopatra has been everything but herself. But the real question is, what makes her identity so controversial? Why do people get so upset when someone claims she was African? Let's be clear. Cleopatra ruled Egypt, a kingdom in Africa. But somehow, the narrative always seems to drift toward her being Mediterranean, sometimes even European. Why? Because Egypt, as one of the world's most ancient civilizations, has often been treated as separate from Africa. From the time of Roman conquest, through colonial eras, and into modern times, there's been an ongoing effort to disconnect Egypt from its African identity, and Cleopatra sits right in the middle of that. Yes, Cleopatra was born into the Ptolemaic dynasty, which originated with Alexander the Great's general, Ptolemy I, who was Greek. Cleopatra's ancestry was primarily Macedonian Greek, but this lineage is only part of the story. While it's true, she was born into a dynasty that ruled Egypt for almost 300 years, her connection to Egypt was far more complex than just Greek bloodlines. Unlike many of her predecessors, Cleopatra made a deliberate effort to identify with Egypt. She learned the Egyptian language, performed in Egyptian rituals, and portrayed herself as a native pharaoh. In fact, she presented herself as more Egyptian than Greek, which has often been overlooked in the discussion of her race and ethnicity. Cleopatra was the queen of Egypt, and Egypt is in Africa. While it is true that Egypt had a long history of foreign rulers, it remains a fact that Cleopatra ruled over an African kingdom. Ancient Egypt was a part of Africa long before European or Mediterranean power structures entered the scene. The Egyptians, Greeks, Romans, and others who came into Egypt's orbit contributed to the rich tapestry of its history. But Egypt's heart remained on the African continent. This fact, Egypt's undeniable location in Africa, should be at the forefront of any conversation about Cleopatra. Yet, we often see Egypt framed as separate from Africa, as if the two cannot coexist. Now let's talk about Cleopatra's legacy. She wasn't just a queen, she was a powerful political figure, a shrewd diplomat, and a symbol of Egypt's strength. Cleopatra fought to maintain Egypt's independence against the growing power of Rome, and she was deeply tied to the cultural and religious practices of Egypt, which were inherently African. Her political savvy, her ability to secure powerful alliances with Roman figures like Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, and her leadership in the face of internal strife, all show how deeply connected she was to Egypt, and, by extension, to Africa. When we claim Cleopatra as African, we are acknowledging her position as part of the vast legacy of African civilization. When Cleopatra entered the Roman sphere of influence, her identity became weaponized. In the struggle for power, particularly with Octavian, later Augustus, Cleopatra's image was used to vilify her. Roman propaganda portrayed her as an exotic, dangerous seductress whose influence over Julius Caesar and Mark Antony threatened Rome itself. But the way the Romans portrayed Cleopatra is not just a political tactic. It's a blueprint for how her image would evolve over the centuries. This portrayal made Cleopatra's African identity controversial because it painted her as an enemy of the Roman Empire, and in doing so, it painted her as something other than the Western ideal. Cleopatra's image underwent a radical transformation during the Renaissance and into modern times. European artists, writers, and filmmakers took the exotic image of Cleopatra and made her part of the European cultural landscape. The Cleopatra of history was remade into a tragic European beauty. But this was a reinvention, not history. This was the European world taking Cleopatra's story and molding it to fit their understanding of beauty and power. When Elizabeth Taylor played Cleopatra in the 1963 film, she was made to look like a Roman goddess, not the African queen she was. When we talk about Cleopatra's race, we have to address the issue head-on. It's a modern debate. The concept of race, as we understand it today, didn't exist in Cleopatra's time. The ancient Egyptians didn't categorize people in the same way that we do today. Cleopatra herself would have been of mixed ancestry. Her Greek paternal line, with potential Egyptian or other ancestral influences through her maternal line. Modern interpretations of Cleopatra's race often try to force her into a category that didn't exist in her time. But the question becomes, does her race even matter? Why does the world get so defensive when someone says Cleopatra was African? He was made to look like a Roman goddess, not the African queen she was. The controversy over Cleopatra's race is more than a question of her ancestry. It's about how we view Africa today. For centuries, Africa has been portrayed as backward, primitive, and disconnected from the world's greatest civilizations. Ancient Egypt, however, remains a shining example of African greatness, and Cleopatra is a part of that legacy. So, when Cleopatra is called African, it challenges the narrative that Africa has no history of civilization or power. It challenges the stereotype that Africa was a place only of tribes and deserts, rather than the cradle of civilization that Egypt represents. The debate over Cleopatra's identity is not just a historical curiosity, it has real-world implications. It's about representation and who gets to define who belongs in the history books. For centuries, Africa has been erased from its own history. Africa's contribution to the world, its science, its philosophy, its art, its empire building, has been minimized or ignored. When we claim Cleopatra as African, we are reclaiming a part of history that has been denied. We are giving a voice to African history that has long been suppressed. Cleopatra was not just a woman of mystery. She was a queen, a ruler, and an icon whose influence stretched far beyond her time. Her African identity is part of her legacy, and it's a legacy that cannot be erased or rewritten. In the end, it's not about whether Cleopatra was black, in the way modern race categories define it, or whether she was Greek in the way her dynasty suggests. It's about acknowledging the complexity of her identity and the complexity of the world she lived in. It's about recognizing that Cleopatra was both an African queen and a global figure, whose legacy deserves to be understood on her own terms. So the next time the debate over Cleopatra's race arises, remember this: history is more complicated than simple labels. Cleopatra's true power lies in her ability to transcend those labels and speak to all of us, no matter where we come from.